Hey y'all, quick announcement. Underhill seems to be the least liked of my stories, and I have to say that I think I know the reason why. Because it just was not ready to be uploaded. It needed far more revision and a lot of condensing to be sure. So I've decided to take Underhill back to the drawing board, so to speak, and make it something that not only am I proud of, but something that y'all actually want to hear. As such, I won't be uploading any more installments of the series until I've made a far better version sometime in the future. The videos which I've already posted will stay up, but no more will be uploaded until I can resolve the series issues. Now, without further ado, I present the final for now installment of Underhill as y'all have come to know it. I hope you enjoy.
Underhill, Part 7. An original short story by Charlie C.C. Thomas. Saturday, March 11th. Sarah stood in the middle of the living room, her gown white and flowing like it were in water. When the burning weight fell from her neck with a clack, the pale man and pale woman set their hands on her cheeks, smiling all the while with bright, kind eyes. Warmth sunk into her flesh and uncoiled in her stomach, branching out like taproots and cementing the yearning, the ache, the want, and burn. Her lips parted on a pant as the pale woman let down the sapphire dress from her shoulder, freeing her left breast as something squirmed in her arms. The pale man undid the delicate buttons of Sarah's gown, sliding the collar from her shoulder and freeing her left breast, his slender fingers brushing something in the crook of her arm. He scooped it up and held a baby to his chest, smiling at it, at Riley, as the woman held out another babe. Sarah stayed as she was, arms frozen to hold her son as a new weight fell into them. A baby, a son, a boy, another Riley. He stared at her from the edge of her vision, squirming at her touch as the man set the other Riley at the pale woman's naked breast. She held him with one arm as her free hand drifted down Sarah's throat, blazing like hungry kisses, and stopped at her nipple. Her razor nails trailed the aching, unhealed scratch and opened it. Warm blood dripped down Sarah's bodice and joined the old stains, reviving the living red over old, dead brown. The woman's hand fluttered to her own breast and nicked herself open, nestling Riley's mouth to her teat before the blood could fall, and held him until he latched on. Sarah looked down with unblinking, teary eyes and tilted her head at the Riley in her arms. She cradled his head and stroked the thickening tuft of hair, lifting his mouth to her nipple and letting him suckle. The corners of her lips curved up as new tears, sweet tears, fell. His little face scrunched up as he gummed her skin, little hand pressing at her breast as he drank, and drank deeper. The pale woman hummed, deep, soft, and sad, tune rolling through the air like tides, filling it with honey and cinnamon, dark earth and wet stone. Sarah's face stretched wide with her smile, whispering the tune and letting it fill her, sway her. She met the other woman's gaze and stayed, gripped into it as the world blurred in her tears, all save for those emerald eyes. They were like mirrors, and opposites, and twins, the mothers, the sisters, the daughters, their emerald and brown eyes, golden and raven hair, marble and tanned skin. Sarah's smile cut her face as she rested in that gaze, the soft green of grass in summer beneath a cloud-covered sun, tickled by wildflowers as children ran and played over rolling hills. She was laid in the curve of the crimson lips, the cushions of a bed with her husband beside, the day's work done and their children asleep with the cover of night to lull them. She was carried with her voice, the sad, gentle lullaby from a mother that caressed her forehead, sick or well, and kissed her face, and told her stories to sleep and wake and learn. The pale man's fingers slid over Sarah's cheek, his long nails brushing near her ear like knives, his skin hot and hotter like he'd sat near a fire. She found his silvery eyes, like the naked, unending wintry sky, with all the memory and promise of summer and spring. His smile lit his face, shaping it like Joseph's when he was happy and sleep-drunk. He turned his gaze to the pale woman and set his other hand on her cheek, thumbs stroking their flesh as Sarah leaned into it, kissing his palm. His smile pulled the flesh of his cheeks until she could see his teeth. All of his teeth. She blinked and opened her eyes on the bedroom ceiling, breathing deeply and blinking away the tears. She swallowed, eyes flitting around as she tried to move her face and felt nothing. Her heart drummed in her chest, filling her ears as she looked around the room.
"Joseph's gone."
She looked down to what she could see of her arm above the sheets, straining in her head, breath like a hiss as she moved her fingers. There wasn't so much as a flinch or flick. She looked back to the ceiling, chest tight with an invisible weight, body thrumming as her jaw slowly unhinged, teeth unclenching and lips quivering open on one side. She tried to scream, but there was only breath. New tears fell as she opened her eyes, sobbing and screaming and thrashing in her mind while her body lay like a corpse between blanket and bed. The bedroom door swiveled open without a sound. Her eyes flew to it, waiting for it to clear so that she could see the one behind.
"Joseph! Baby, help!"
she screamed in her mind. The door cleared the doorway, and someone stood in the shadow, pale and covered in gold and red, stepping into the early rays of sunlight. His long silver hair glittered like his eyes. A gentle smile sat between his cheeks, warming the glossy white skin. Sarah sucked in a sharp breath through her nostrils, coming out like a hiss as she tried to scream. Her skin crawled with goosebumps as he stepped closer, weight on her chest sinking as he clasped his hands behind his back, face aglow in sunlight like a candle, feet deafening quiet. She held his eye as he stopped at the foot of her bed, hands coming around to grab the cushions and pull himself over her feet. Her eyes widened, the bed sinking around her as his slender, strong limbs carried him over her legs like a cat. He stopped at her chest, standing over her on his knees, neck bent in half to stare down at her with kind eyes and a warm smile framed by locks of silver. He lowered himself onto her chest, knees bent in her armpits as he sank onto her breastbone, crushing her like he were twice Joseph's weight. The air ran out of her mouth as he smiled wider at her round, weeping eyes. She sputtered her breath, lips caught on her teeth as she tried to inhale against his weight. His slender, white fingers, cold and hot at the same time, crept up her chest, her throat, her face, taking it in both hands. His fingers dragged over her skin, sharp as razors and sending waves of goosebumps down her body. His eyes swallowed her, holding her still in their jaws. He leaned down, red lips pursing like he'd caught her up with his charm and brought her home. His thumbs stroked her skin, smooth as stone and polished steel, mouth hovering just over hers and eyes inches from one another. His lips parted over too many slender teeth. Clover, honey, and pepper fell onto her face, stinging her eyes and coating her throat, pulling up bile as it mingled, turning bitter in her mouth like burnt coffee. He smelled her, long and longer, the smell like thunder in the quiet, and fluttered his eyes shut, smile growing until it cut his face in half. Her eyes blew open as he found her gaze again, shine coming from his dilated pupils, and pressed their mouths together. Her eyes jumped side to side, screaming for her body to move, to hit him, to kick him off and scream and punch and bite. But she lay there like the dead, bile filling her mouth as his cold tongue slithered inside and tasted her. His breath came quick as his manhood pressed against her chest. Ash and charcoal and soil flooded her mouth and sank into her throat, churning her stomach as something else twanged her tongue. It was slight, barely a drop in an ocean, but it was there. Blood. He pulled away, his long tongue sliding back past his lips as his smile shrank. He tilted his head and mouthed, "Thank you," before his thumbs came up to her eyes and pulled down her lids, banishing her to darkness. She trembled, pulse pounding and hot, angry tears rolling down the sides of her face. Shh. His breath blew over her, sweet and bitter and wild as the rot of autumn leaves. She shivered, and silence filled the room, deafening, ringing in her ears. She lay there for moments, waiting for something, anything, heart pounding, limbs quivering. The weight and stink and touch floated off her like 1,000 moths, and she opened her eyes with a gasp, jumping up onto her elbows. She looked around the room, eyes falling on Joseph's empty side of the bed as she took a deep breath and winced, clutching at her chest. Her ribs strained and popped as she stretched and rolled her shoulders. She swallowed down her spit and cleared her throat, filling her lungs until the ache was gone. The headboard was cool against her back as she pulled herself up, eyes fixing on the shut bedroom door. "Another one," she thought. "Worse. Much worse." She touched her lips and shivered, gagging at the taste that memory put into her mouth. Her fingers fell from her face to her chest and stopped when she didn't find the cross. She felt around her neck, but it was gone. Again. She sighed and stared into the nothing, waiting for it to stare back, half wishing that it would. "At least then I wouldn't be crazy," she thought. "Just cursed." She turned her head to the nightstand and the charging laptop, pressing her lips tight before reaching for it and opening a new document, letting the dream run from behind her eyes and out her fingers. It was so similar to almost every other night that it was finished with just a few minutes and a run to the bathroom. In the end, she stared at it, rereading and playing the other dreams in the back of her mind. "There's always the two of them. We always swap Rileys," she thought, tapping her thumbnail on her teeth. "She always pierces her nipples," she continued aloud, hand falling to her tender left breast. She looked down to it and sighed, pulling the baggy nightshirt up to look at the short, straight scab. "No redness, no blood, no bruising, but it hasn't gone away. Then I always think I wake up paralyzed." She dropped the shirt over her briefs and sat back, arms falling aside as her messy bun knocked the headboard. She stared at the ceiling, through it, and sighed, whispering, "The only thing's the man. Getting closer and closer each time," she thought. "And now he's assaulting me." He flashed over her eyes, the memory of the smell, the taste, bringing up bile as she shivered and wiped at her mouth, shutting her laptop and sliding it aside. She tossed her legs over the edge of the bed and looked out at the early morning, snow refusing to leave, sparkling under the sunny, pale sky. She stood, groaning as her body protested and stretched. She yawned as the energy she had in the bed stayed there, getting further and further away as she shuffled to the shut door and swung it open on an empty, dim hall. She rubbed her eyes, dangling hands bumping into the rail before she rounded the landing and plodded down the steps, yawning again as she shuffled into the kitchen. She smiled as Joseph turned, face alight and black gaze glittering. Her heavy eyes traveled up his arms and back, over the goosebumps and well-used muscle, until she sank into his smile. Her foot caught her heel and sent her shoulder barreling into the fridge with a grunt, then a sigh, and a tired laugh. "You okay?" Joseph chuckled.
"Dandy."
She waddled to the counter beside the stove, rubbing her eyes as he flipped the pancakes in the skillet, blueberries bleeding dark as chocolate.
"How'd Riley do?"
"He's fine. Left me a nasty stink bomb right after I changed him. He's going to be a troublemaker, I swear." He pointed the spatula at her with a smirk. Her lips tugged up at the corners, but the rest of her face hung off the bone. "Did you get any sleep?" he asked, flicking between her and the food out of the corner of his eye.
"What? Don't I look rejuvenated?"
She crossed her arms with a smirk, letting her face slump back into place.
"No, I got sleep. Full 8 hours. But it's like I don't sleep when I sleep, you know?"
He nodded. "Yeah, that's what you said. So, the melatonin isn't helping then? Maybe some warm tea?" He shrugged his shoulders, picking up the pancakes to check the bottoms and plating them. She let her lower back sink into the counter with a sigh.
"Honestly, and I'm not joking, I swear, I only ever feel like I sleep after we have sex."
He smirked and crossed his arms, facing her as the skillet steamed. "Well, I'd be more than happy to help you get plenty of rest then, Mrs. Bowen." She smiled and let her head tilt back.
"I know you would. I would. But seriously, it's weird, right?"
He picked up the last of the batter and poured it into the pan before facing her, glittering eyes warm like invisible candles. "Maybe it's the exertion. We could always do an exercise after dinner to get you tired." She nodded, eyes drifting to the island, ears perking up at Riley's laughter.
"Maybe. But I've run almost every day and tried to get back into yoga. I'm still not sleeping.
He leaned into her, bending his neck so they were nearly face to face, and smiled. "If what we're trying isn't working, then we'll just figure it out. I don't care if it's whale songs and a nightcap." He turned to stand straight and cupped her face, thumb stroking her cheek. She shivered, forcing a smile as the dream, the pale man, the smell, rushed in her mind. "I just want you to get better. I can't stand to see you not be... you." He kissed her forehead, and she breathed deeply, forcing his smell in over the memory of cinnamon and dirt and blood. His body wash, his aftershave, his morning breath, his sweat, his skin. Him. He was Joseph, not the pale man. Her Jojo. Her chest clenched and she smiled wide, pushing up on her tiptoes to kiss his mouth. It was short, but there was more in it than if she'd wrote a book. She pulled back and stood under him, his hand finding her hip and hers his chest.
"He's Joseph,"
she thought.
"This is Jojo, my husband."
She repeated it as he smiled over her, leaning in for another kiss that traveled to her cheek and a peck to her neck.
"This is Joseph,"
she repeated, but her skin crawled, mouth dry and throat tight as the pale man's face filled her eyes, mouth on her, tongue slithering inside.
"Babe, the food,"
she whispered, forcing out a pant to at least make his touch feel welcome. He sighed and pecked her lips, going back to the skillet and flipping the pancakes. "Thanks." Her mouth went tight, and she sighed, thinking,
"I'm not letting you ruin this."
She raised up on her tiptoes and kissed his jaw, whispering,
"I love you, Jojo."
He smiled as she stepped away and walked around the island to Riley, legs and arms kicking as he played with the hanging toys on his playmat. "You haven't called me that in a while."
"It's not too childish, is it?"
She flicked up to him as he chuckled and shook his head, grinning before she knelt. She sat on her hip beside Riley, mouth wide in a silent hello, as his bright eyes, now mossy green, lit up around his smile. "I don't care," said Joseph, scraping the pan. "It's our thing." He came around the island and lifted the plate in the air. She nodded, smile wide before she yawned and stroked her thumb over Riley's chest.
"What are you doing?"
she asked, looking up as Joseph fell cross-legged beside her with a plate of pancakes between them, bowl of honey in the middle. Well, we can't have a picnic outside yet. Besides, he picked up a pancake and dipped it in the honey, holding it up for her to bite. You haven't gotten to see the little monster yet, so... He wiggled the pancake with a grin. She took it before the honey dripped everywhere, thanks in her eyes before they rolled back with a hum and swallow. He chuckled. I'm glad you like 'em. So, what do you want to do today? He munched on his own pancake, humming at his handiwork and finding her again. Motioning toward her, he sat back and to the side, holding himself up with one hand. We could stay in and watch some movies, or we can call Maddie and see if she wants to come over for dinner. We could even call some of the guys and make it a whole event. She smiled sheepishly, the image of 8 people in their house and 3 kids instead of just the one screaming behind her eyes. I don't think I've got anything set out for a group that big. It could be a potluck, if you want. I'm good to stay in and call it a lazy day. He smirked, honey gleaming on his lower lip. She smiled and ran her finger over his mouth, wiping up the honey and licking it clean. His eyes went dark over a smirk as he licked his thumb and picked up another pancake, holding it up to her lips. The heat and sweetness filled her nose, mouth watering as she smirked and took a bite, leaving the rest for him to eat. Lazy day sounds good, she said around her food. But I want to get out of the house for a bit. You want to go for a walk around the neighborhood? Could go into town for a bit and window shop or something. She shook her head and leaned back on her elbow, dancing her fingers in front of Riley's face. He giggled and reached, grabbing and pulling them into his mouth, suckling the honey free. She chuckled and looked back, finding Joseph's dopey grin, mind 100 layers deep in thought until he caught her eye. Is it all right if I go to the park? Just me and Riley? Of course. I've been meaning to work on my truck anyway. It's just been a while since me and the monster have been alone. Plus, I know you want to tinker. It's been acting up, hasn't it? He nodded. Nothing serious. Little man's more important than Daddy's truck, huh? He asked Riley, crawling up over him and smiling like a cartoon with wide eyes. Riley laughed and kicked his little feet as Joseph tickled up his sides and growled up his tiny stomach. Riley screamed with laughter, grabbing at Joseph's stubbly face and holding him there. Is Mommy gonna be okay to drive? He asked Riley. She hasn't slept well, and we don't want her getting hurt, do we, little man? Sarah kissed his cheek and propped her head in her hand, Joseph never taking his eyes off of Riley and going back down to blow on his stomach. Laughter filled the kitchen, high and shrieking as he flailed and smiled. She stroked Joseph's bare back, the ache in her chest replaced by a pulsing warmth that unraveled like a flower. I'll be all right. If I get too tired, I'll call you and come home. It'll just be an hour or so anyway. Sarah pushed the stroller down the cleared paths of the park. Snowy hills sat either side, gathered at the bases of the old oaks and ashes, the last vestiges of color under the pale sky, dark and dull as they were. She looked down at Riley, asleep with the blanket up to his chin and his little beanie hugged around his ears. She chuckled to herself and looked back at the field to her right, once so green and full of movement in the summer, now only a sea of dirty snow and black-barked trees. Even the playground ahead was empty. A dystopian winterscape. The steps and bars were capped with undisturbed snow, the mulch lost under the white blanket, the path untouched, probably for weeks, months. She stared as her boots thudded closer, smiling at the memories painting the world behind her eyes. She and Joseph as children, with a dozen others after school, running, climbing and screaming. Then as teenagers, meeting up at night to drink and smoke. Joseph never showed up much to those parties. She sighed, stopping next to a cleared bench to stare at the memory of her first kiss. He'd just graduated when she was a senior. He was tall, handsome, and a smooth talker, told everyone he was getting a motorcycle. He'd had 2 tattoos no one knew about save for the girls he showed, one on his back, the other trailing from his belly button into his jeans. She thought he was dangerous. She thought he'd scoop her up and run her off into another life to see the world on his bike. The kiss was awful. He didn't scoop her up, didn't even get to second base, and he never left town. He did get a motorcycle, though. Now he rides it to and from the Homer Grocers, his family's business, and hides all his tattoos with button-ups and khakis.
Devin Homer,
she laughed and shook her head, looking down at Riley.
That boy was a mess. What teenager isn't?
She looked back at the playground and her smile warmed as she watched Joseph carry her on his back across the summer grass. Their first date. Barely out of high school and blissfully unaware of the responsibilities life had in store for them, he'd chased her around like they were kids. They'd climbed the monkey bars and he'd tried to swing across with just his feet.
You did it,
she said to herself as much as Riley.
Almost skinned the top of your feet, but you did it.
She smiled and sat, watching their second kiss.
That one was better than the first. 3 Minutes in Heaven is such a stupid game.
She chuckled and closed her black coat against the cold. He'd kissed her like he still did. One hand on her cheek, the other on her waist, bodies close, lips hungry but asking permission, eyes shut.
He got me hook, line, and sinker, your dad,
she said to Riley. He stirred, wrinkling his face against the cold. She rocked the stroller and pulled the cover over him to block the breeze, humming something low and sad. When she looked back, the playground was empty of memory and full of promise. The image of Riley, a little older, ran through the playground, bundled like a marshmallow with a smile cutting his face and a laugh so contagious no one could keep from joining him. He would climb the bars beside the other children. He would play with them, laugh with them. She could see them clear as day, tall and short, younger and older, dressed in wintry clothes with onyx, copper, silver, and golden hair. They were pale in the sunlight, but their clothes were bright and beautiful. They smiled in the silly, serious way that children do, chasing one another, dancing with Riley, pulling him into one game after another. He'd smile the wider and laugh the louder, his eyes bright as diamonds. She sat back as the wind picked up, pulling at her braided hair. She grinned and watched the children play, lithe and full of energy, with a teenager at the lead.
An older brother, probably,
she thought. They raced and spun. Some fell down, but they jumped back into the game, running after one another and leaping. She breathed deeply, warm cinnamon and hazelnut, coating her throat like a fresh coffee, and warmed into her muscles as the wind flowed over her. The leaves rustled and whispered as all the children took hands, Riley with them, his coat gone, and spun in a large circle. 24 children, skin shining like polished marble, eyes glittering like freshly cut gems, wind tossing their hair like spun metal. They laughed high and sweet, the pitch climbing and falling with the wind and rhythm of their dance, feet flying into the circle, then out, then kicking up. Hands came into the air as they tossed their heads back and lifted their voices in a song, lyrics lost in the wind and flying snow. They clapped their hands and stomped their feet in time with the song, the melody quick and infectious, stitching into her legs until they almost joined them. Then they took hands and shuffled their feet. She smiled, watching under heavy eyes as they locked arms and danced, pointed feet dragging the ground before they spun and danced the other way with a resounding clap. Riley disappeared behind the slides, but he was fine and smiling and safe. All the children were happy. They wouldn't have smiles like that unless everything was perfect. Her eyes washed over their faces, the full, rosy cheeks, the pale, veiny skin, the eyes almost glowing in the sunlight, their high, sharp smiles. She swallowed and clove coated her tongue as churning soil filled the air from their dancing feet. Her arms and legs unwound, settling around her as the children jumped, clapped, and spun. Their voices came high and beautiful like a choir, the words unimportant, clinking and twanging like bells and chimes. She furrowed her brow as something tugged at her chest, something distant and dull and aching. She tilted her head to look beside her, a shadow rising in the corner of her eye behind Riley's stroller.
No,
she thought, her mind moving like misfitted cogs.
Too pale. Not shadow.
The children turned around as one, clapping and half shouting their tune. She flicked back to find them grinning, shadow gone, and she giggled drunkenly. They stared out at the world with glittering gem eyes and sharp carved faces, gleaming like oiled stone. They sang, the wind carrying their words to her ears, strange words, spilt through skinny teeth and smiles that rose and rose and rose. She swallowed and tried to sit up, but she was too heavy. The song came, voices like bells and chimes on the wind as their feet beat the earth into hollow drums. Hard stomps echoed through the park beside claps, sharp as cymbals and fluid alien words. The wind whirled, smacking her face and filling her chest with roses and honey and soil and cold fire. She gasped and pushed herself up, eyes fixing on the children as their faces turned to her. They kept singing and dancing and spinning. They moved the circle to one side, still watching her as their smiles grew and the veins under their skin ran black as dirt. Their ears perked up like cats, too big and in the wrong place. Riley peeked from the back, watching her with yellow eyes and smiling.
Miss?
Something touched her shoulder. She sat up and whirled, vision full of a woman's face, curly hair pulled back in a tight bun, hooded vest coat open over running clothes. She stood up straight, hands out and open to show her peace.
Are you okay?
Sarah looked behind her and grabbed the stroller's handle, peeling back the cover and sighing with relief at Riley's curious face. He stared up at her with honey eyes, still as a bird as he tilted his head and watched her. She smiled at him and set her fingers to his hand. He looked down and pushed at it, clenching and unclenching his fingers over her knuckles like he didn't know if he should take it. She swallowed and turned back to the woman, the sun turning her olive skin almost ashen.
I'm fine. I must have just dozed off. Are you sure?
She motioned to the path as she continued.
I passed you like twice. You must have been pretty tired.
The woman chuckled nervously, eyes flitting to the stroller. Sarah sighed through a smile.
New mom. Not a lot of sleep, but I'm fine now.
She stood and dusted off the flurries of snow that had settled on her lap and shoulders.
I actually need to be getting back home, but thank you for checking on me. Anyone could have come up and messed with my poor boy.
The woman grinned nervously and nodded, waving as she picked up her stride and bounded back through the park. Sarah turned to watch her, hand fishing her phone from her pocket. She held it up, furrowing her brow at the 4 missed calls and texts from Joseph and Maddie. She unlocked the screen and stopped at the time, looking back at the sun and swallowing.
An hour?
Something moved in the corner of her eye and stopped. A shadowed, pale thing holding something to its chest. She faced it, and nothing stared back. Empty air with the outline of memory. Her skin bristled and the wind slapped her. She pulled her coat close as she ignored the nothing and called Joseph, holding her phone with her shoulder as she pushed the stroller back the way she'd come. "Sarah?" Joseph blurted. "Babe, are you okay?"
Yeah, I'm fine. Sorry, I worried you. I dozed off on a bench.
Joseph breathed like he was going to ask 100 questions, but she cut him off.
I'm fine, and so's Riley. I think
I had a waking dream or something. Just got lost in my head's all.
Where are you?
On my way back to the car. I'll be fine to drive home.
Why don't you let me pick you up? I mean, if you're that tired. She sighed.
Joe, I'm fine.
You just passed out for 40 minutes or something, so I think I can question if that's true. He sighed, and his voice came back stern and clear and terrified. Seriously, are you good? She smiled with a nervous chuckle, looking back and finding nothing watching her.
Yeah, I'm good. I'm almost out of the park now. Then it's just a hop, skip, and jump to Grandma's house.
'Cause I could come and pick you up, and take Maddie back later to bring your car home. It wouldn't be a problem.
Jojo, it's not that serious. No need to get Maddie in a tizzy.
She's already offered to go hunting for you. Sarah barked a laugh as she went through the parking lot for her car, fishing her keys out of her purse hanging on the stroller.
Seriously, babe, I'm okay. I'm actually not tired anymore. I probably just needed the fresh air and sunshine or something.
She unlocked the back seat and clipped Riley into his base, shutting it and folding down the stroller for the trunk, Joseph sighing and asking her twice if she were sure.
Baby, I really appreciate that you love me this much, but I'm already in the driver's seat. I'll stay on the phone with you until I get home because I'm overly cautious, but I think I can drive home without falling asleep. It's not like I have narcolepsy.
Fine. Well, what was your dream about then?
Dream?
She backed up, chest tight as the circle of children smiled at her in the back of her head, faces cut in two with teeth and flesh. Yeah, you said you had a waking dream. Tell me what it was about, so you don't forget and can add it to your journal. She smirked and pulled forward.
You mean so that you can keep me talking and I don't fall asleep at the wheel?
Well, now that you mention it, that does sound like an added benefit.
Smartass.
She sighed and pulled onto the road.
Well, I was next to the playground, and imagine Riley old enough to play when all these kids joined him and sang and danced in a big circle, only they turned into the things from my other dreams, and they all stared at me and kept dancing, and then I saw Riley in the back just before a woman woke me up.
She shivered. You didn't wake up on your own? She sighed.
No.
He took a deep breath away from the phone. Babe, this is getting a little more serious than you just not sleeping.
Joseph, I'm fine.
She looked in the rearview mirror and jumped at the pale shadows swimming through the air next to Riley. She spun around and flicked her eyes over the back seat at the nothing before she whirled forward. The light ahead turned red as Joseph said something. She grabbed the wheel and hit the brakes, jerking them forward. She sat back, waiting for Riley's cry and furrowing her brow when it didn't come. She twisted around and looked into his carrier seat, finding his curious eyes, head tilting at her like she were a new animal that he had to puzzle out. She smiled at him and nodded with a silent sigh, falling back into her seat.
Sorry, babe. Was checking on Riley. What did you say?
He chuckled. I said the guy called again. The assistant, or whatever, for the buyer.
I thought you blocked the number.
He used another one. He said that he wants to interview us about the pendant.
You said no, I take it?
The guy's been harassing us, so yeah. Said something about doing research into the set or something. And he wanted to talk to people that had contact with them. He was going to interview people from the church. Said Nathan was involved, I think.
Father Nathaniel?
His face flashed in her mind. Worry, concern, confusion. The forces those priests called up are real, he'd said. Just promise me you won't go looking into this. Okay. The light turned green, and she turned left, following the empty streets as she flicked between the road and the rearview mirror, finding the empty air. I'll take over from here. Yeah, Joseph broke through her thought. I mean, I don't get why they can't just do research online like everyone else. Even if this kid's boss is ancient, it'd be easier to just Google. I mean, I did.
Maybe
She licked her lips, forcing them into a grin.
Maybe he wants to collect a bunch of different points of view and compare them.
She shrugged her shoulders, turning down the last street to their road, eyes flicking into the rearview mirror and back.
You're just being paranoid.
She chided herself before continuing aloud.
I mean, you said the guy kept warning you about a curse or something. Maybe it's a paranormal documentary.
Yeah, and we need to be in a paranormal documentary. I don't want this guy coming to our house, Sarah.
Okay, I don't either, but I mean, what if there is something going on?
Silence, then a breath. Do you really think... She swallowed at the severity in his voice.
Look, Father Nathaniel sort of freaked out when I told him about the pendant.
Wait, when was that? Why didn't you tell me?
I didn't want to worry you. I know I said I wouldn't do that. I thought it was in my head, but...
Shivers danced up her back like someone's breath had rolled over her nape.
It sounds like this kid's gonna be in town anyway, so he's going to try and find us and ask for an interview or whatever it is.
Then I'll tell him to leave. Joseph groaned. The last thing we need to do is draw attention to this. If it is real, we'd just be giving it power, wouldn't we?
I think that's just in movies.
She grinned, turning onto their street.
Ever the horror fan, but I was suggesting we meet him somewhere, give him an interview, and get it done and him out of our hair.
Who's to say that it won't just humor him and make his boss think that he can come and get info from us whenever?
Who's to say it would? It might just be a one and done, maybe 2 or 3 and done.
She parked behind Joseph's truck, his toolbox and equipment sitting haphazard on the front porch.
Besides, the boss guy's rich, right? Maybe it could lead to some money. If we're in a published documentary, we can have our identities hidden and still get royalties. Maybe a job?
The chuckle left her voice as the pale faces danced around the back of her mind.
And if this guy's for real, well, maybe he'd know what's going on.
What if it puts Riley's name everywhere and just keeps kids from treating him normally? She furrowed her brows.
How's that?
She stepped out into the stagnant cold and opened Riley's door, their eyes grazing over one another as she undid the buckle. If this guy says something weird, like cursed families of evil or something, kids are jerks, Sarah.
You can always teach him to throw punches,
she said under her breath. Sarah. She chuckled, pulling Riley free as she shut the door and headed for the front gate.
I know, I'm just teasing, but seriously, let's just get the interview over with. He's gonna try. Why not give him what he wants just to keep him out of our hair? We can at least tell him we'll feel him out, and if we don't like it, then we're done. End of story.
He sighed. Was that your doors I heard?
Yeah, about to come inside.
All right, just come in and we can talk about it later. His footsteps padded on the wooden floors as she climbed the steps, and he hung up. The door pulled open, and he stepped out in worn jeans and a t-shirt, hand taking Riley and letting Sarah pass through before he shut the door.
Just so you know, I'm fine.
He grabbed her arm and spun her around, pulling her into his chest as he enveloped her, pecking the top of her head. Don't ever freak me out like that again. She smiled and kissed his chest before looking up into his burnt black eyes.
I'll do my best. Now, do me a favor.
He smirked and pressed their foreheads together.
Chill a little bit. I'm good. It was weird and I want to get checked out, but I'm fine.
Promise me. He cupped her face. If you think something's wrong, promise that you'll tell me. None of that suffer in silence crap. I'm your husband. I want to help you, even if that means calling a stupid priest. His mouth went flat as he searched her eyes. So promise me. Her face went warm as he filled her vision, blocking out the rest of the world. Her hands laced his wrists, smile small beneath serious eyes as she kissed his chin.
I promise.
Hey y'all, thanks for listening. I hope that you enjoyed, and I hope that you stick around for my other work that you'll find here somewhere at the end of the video. If y'all want to help out the channel, then go ahead and subscribe, give a like, comment, and share a video of your choosing with a friend. Until next time, bye y'all.